August 15, 1945, known Hirohito, the 124th Emperor of Japan, and speaks to his people for the first time. He has been emperor since 1926. He has been a living god, not metaphorically, not symbolically, not in the attenuated sense that the word divine sometimes carries in political language, but a living god in the literal sense that the framework his government had built required its citizens to believe, a direct descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, through an unbroken line of imperial succession, stretching back to the mythological founding of Japan in 660 BCE. His person was sacred. His photograph could not be looked at carelessly. His name could not be spoken by ordinary citizens without ritual preparation. He is ending a war. The recording is 4 minutes and 37 seconds long. It is played twice. The voice is difficult to understand for reasons that go beyond the static and the archaic language. The emperor's dialect is the dialect of a court that exists in a register above ordinary Japanese speech. And the radio equipment has degraded the signal. People press their ears to speakers on street corners, in public squares, in the ruins of buildings that used to be homes. Some of them weep before they have fully understood what is being said. Some of them understand immediately, and weep for a different reason. Because what the emperor is saying in the formal language, that wraps the meaning in layers of court vocabulary, that speaks of enduring the unendurable and bearing the unbearable, that never uses the words surrender or defeat, is that Japan has lost, that the war that had been fought in his name, in the name of his divine mission, in the name of the sacred national polity, whose protection had been presented as the reason for every sacrifice demanded of every citizen over the previous 14 years. This war is over. The god is speaking, and what the god is saying is, it is finished. In the streets, the weeping is indistinguishable grief for the dead, relief that it is over, confusion about what it means that a god could lose. All three of these feelings are present simultaneously in the people kneeling in the August heat, and none of them cancels the others out. In the imperial palace compound, several army officers who cannot accept what they are hearing commit suicide. One of them, before dying, faces the direction of the imperial household and bows. Even at the moment of its collapse, the framework holds. This episode is about the framework those people had been living inside. Not Shinto as a religion. Shinto is an ancient tradition with a history and complexity that this episode cannot do full justice to, and which is not reducible to what the Meiji and later governments made of it. Not Japanese culture in the broad sense, which does not reduce to its most militarized 20th century expression any more than German culture reduces to Nazism. The specific framework this episode is about is Kokutai, a word that is usually translated as national polity, but that translation does not carry the weight the word carried in 20th century Japan. Kokutai was the claim that Japan was not merely a nation-state in the European sense, a political entity with defined borders and shared interests. It was the claim that Japan was a divine family, with the emperor as its sacred father, its national existence as an expression of cosmic order, and its destiny as a mission assigned by the gods at the moment of creation. This claim was not ancient. It was constructed, deliberately and systematically, in the second half of the 19th century, built by Meiji-era officials who understood what they were doing and why. Dressed in the vocabulary of antiquity and presented as eternal truth that had always been true and was now simply being made visible. The construction is the story, and where the construction led the war. The kamikaze pilots, the civilians who killed themselves with hand grenades on Pacific islands rather than surrender. The 4 million Japanese who died between 1941 and 1945 is what makes the construction worth examining. Before getting to what Kokutai did, it is necessary to say what it was not. And the usual disclaimer this season has been carrying applies here with particular force. The Japanese people in the years covered by this episode were not a monolith. Resistance existed. Doubt existed privately, in forms that could not be expressed publicly without severe consequences, but existed nonetheless. The civilians who died in firebombing and in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not agents of militarist ideology. The soldiers who fought were not all fighting for the reasons the framework offered. Some were fighting for their families, their villages, their neighbors, in the way that soldiers in most wars are fighting for the people immediately around them rather than the ideology their government has assigned to the conflict. And the Kokutai framework was not the only cause of the Pacific War. Imperial ambition, resource competition, the specific dynamics of Japanese military politics, Western colonialism, and its role in the Asian context in which Japan was operating. All of these are genuine factors that a fuller account would integrate. What this episode is examining is the prophetic structure of one element of that picture, the framework that made certain decisions feel not just strategically correct, but cosmically necessary. That made surrender feel not just politically difficult, but ontologically impossible. That made the death of millions feel not just acceptable, but required by the nature of reality. The framework did not cause all of it. It made all of it more extreme, more durable, and more resistant to the normal mechanisms by which institutions revise their course when the evidence says they should. That is what this season has been about. Japan in 1853 was a country that had, for more than 200 years, chosen not to be part of the world that was then consuming it. The Tokugawa shogunate, the military government that had ruled Japan since 1603, had imposed a policy of sakoku, closed country, that restricted foreign trade to a small number of Dutch and Chinese merchants at a single port in Nagasaki, prohibited Japanese citizens from traveling abroad, and excluded Christian missionaries along with most of the political and intellectual currents that were reshaping Europe and the Americas during this period. This was not an accident or a failure. It was a policy. The Tokugawa government had looked at what Christianity and European trade had done to other Asian societies, the fragmentation, the dependency, the loss of political control, and had concluded that the most reliable path to stability was to close the door. For 200 years, this policy worked. The Japan the Perry's ships entered in 1853 was internally stable, economically developed in its own terms, culturally sophisticated, and almost entirely unprepared for what the Industrial Revolution had made of the outside world. The black ships were not merely ships. They were a demonstration, intended as a demonstration, chosen for their effect that the industrialized West had developed a category of power that Japan's existing framework had no response to. The shogunate negotiated. It opened ports under duress. It attempted to modernize enough to be able to deal with the external threat without destabilizing the internal order. It failed. In 1868, in the revolution known as the Meiji Restoration, the shogunate was overthrown. The emperor was restored to nominal sovereignty after centuries in which his role had been largely ceremonial, and a new government of young samurai reformers, brilliant, pragmatic, genuinely alarmed, and very fast-moving, took control of the state. Their project was, in the broadest terms, the modernization of Japan fast enough to prevent the fate of China, which had been carved into spheres of influence by Western powers who were not asking for consent from being visited on Japan. They succeeded. By any measure of the outcomes they were aiming for, they succeeded remarkably. What they built in the process of succeeding is what this episode is about. The Meiji leaders faced a problem that is familiar from other episodes this season. They needed to build a new state, one capable of the industrial development, military modernization, and administrative centralization required to function in the 19th century international order. The old order had been organized around the shogun, the regional lords, the samurai class, and a system of loyalties and obligations that had held for 2 centuries. The new order required a different kind of loyalty, not loyalty to a local lord or a regional system, but loyalty to the nation-state as an entity, the kind of national identification that European nationalism had been constructing, with varying degrees of violence and success. For the better part of a century, the Meiji leaders needed their population to become, in a specific modern sense, Japanese, to identify with Japan as an entity, to be willing to die for it, to accept the demands of a conscript army and an industrializing economy in the name of something larger than their village or their lord. The question was what that something larger would be. The European model nation-states built on ethnicity, shared language, and historical narrative was available but incomplete. Japan had the ethnicity and the shared language. What it needed was the narrative, and specifically a narrative that would do more than bind the population to the state in the pragmatic sense. A narrative that would explain why Japan's modernization was not merely a political project but a cosmic necessity. Why the sacrifices it required were not merely strategic trade-offs, but spiritual obligations. Why the Japanese nation deserved to survive and thrive in the Darwinian world of imperial competition, not just because it was strong but because it was right. The raw material for this narrative had always existed. Shinto, the ancient indigenous religious tradition of Japan, included the account of the divine creation of the Japanese islands by the gods Izanagi and Izanami, the descent of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, as the progenitor of the imperial line, and the founding of Japan by the Emperor Jimmu in 660 BCE. These were mythological accounts that had coexisted for centuries with Buddhism and with various practical, secular understandings of political authority. The Meiji reformers took these accounts and turned them into a state ideology. The process is worth examining in detail, because it is one of the most thorough and deliberate constructions of a prophetic framework in the modern period. The Meiji government began in 1868 by separating Shinto from Buddhism, reversing centuries of syncretic practice, in which the 2 traditions had intermingled, and establishing Shinto as the state religion. This was presented as restoration, the recovery of the original, pure religious tradition of Japan, purged of the Buddhist accretions that had obscured it. In reality, it was construction, the creation of a standardized, centralized Shinto practice that had never existed in the form being prescribed. Local shrines that had venerated local deities were reorganized into a national hierarchy, with the Ice Grand Shrine dedicated to Amaterasu at the apex. Priests became government employees. Ritual practice was standardized. The state now owned and administered the religious infrastructure of the country, and the religious infrastructure was now oriented toward a single theological claim: the emperor is divine. Japan is a sacred family. The national community is not merely a political entity, but a spiritual one. Its existence grounded in the cosmos rather than in law or consent. In 1889, the Meiji Constitution formalized this claim in legal terms. Article 1. The Empire of Japan shall be reigned over and governed by a line of emperors, unbroken for ages, eternal. Article 3. The emperor is sacred and inviolable, not symbolic head of state, not constitutional monarch in the European sense. Sacred, inviolable. In 1890, the Imperial Rescript on Education was issued, a brief document that became, arguably, the most memorized text in Japanese history. Every student in Japan was required to memorize it. Every school was required to display a copy alongside a photograph of the emperor. The document instructed Japanese subjects on the nature of their relationship to the emperor and the state, that they were his children. that their duties to the nation were extensions of their duties to him as father. That dying for the emperor was not sacrifice but fulfillment. The rescript was recited at school assemblies. It was recited before ceremonies. It was recited at the moment of departure for the front. It was not recited because people were afraid not to. Though that was also true. Many of the people reciting it believed it, because they had been taught to believe it from the moment they entered school, in a system that had been built specifically to produce that belief. This is worth slowing down on. The Meiji education system was one of the most thorough programs of ideological formation in the modern world. It was modeled, in its administrative structure, on Prussian education, but it was filled with content that was specific to the Kokutai framework, the divine origin of the emperor, the sacred nature of the Japanese national community, the special destiny of Japan in Asia. Children who entered this system at age 6 emerged, after 8 years of compulsory schooling, with a set of beliefs about the nature of Japan, the emperor, and their own obligations to both, that were not experienced as beliefs, they were experienced as facts. The way gravity is a fact, the way the sun rising is a fact. The framework was not being imposed on a reluctant population through force alone. It was being installed in a willing population through education. Because children do not arrive at school with a prior framework to defend against the one being offered, the word Kokutai deserves attention before proceeding, because it carries more conceptual freight than any single English translation can hold. The characters are Goti Koku, country, nation, and Tai, body, substance, essence, the body of the nation. But the connotation is theological rather than anatomical, not the physical territory or the political organization, but the essential spiritual substance of Japan as a divine entity. Kokutai was the claim that Japan was not like other countries. Other countries were political constructs, arrangements of power and territory that had emerged from history through the ordinary mechanisms of conquest. Diplomacy. Negotiation. Japan was different. Japan had been created by the gods, given its emperor by the divine lineage that ran from Amaterasu, and organized as a sacred family rather than a political unit. This meant that the emperor's authority was not derived from his subjects. It was not constitutional authority in the sense of authority granted by the people to a sovereign. It was sacred authority, inherent in his divine nature, prior to and foundational for any political arrangement. The emperor did not rule because the people consented. The people were part of the emperor, members of his sacred family, and their identity as Japanese was inseparable from their relationship to him. The implications of this claim ramified outward in ways that the Meiji designers understood and later generations would operationalize. If the emperor was divine, and his authority was sacred, then opposition to his government was not merely political dissent. It was impiety, a violation of the cosmic order, a rejection of one's own nature as a Japanese person. Opposition to the state was not a right. It was a contradiction in terms. A Japanese person who opposed the sacred polity was, in a specific sense, no longer fully Japanese. This is the mechanism this season has traced in every episode, the framework that converts political dissent into cosmic violation, that makes disagreement not merely inconvenient but ontologically incoherent. In the Soviet case, disagreement was irrationality, a failure to grasp the objective laws of history. In the Kokutai framework, disagreement was impiety, a denial of one's own divine heritage. The endpoint was the same, a framework in which the normal mechanisms of political revision debate, or the possibility of acknowledging that the current policy is wrong, were blocked at the structural level, not through force alone but through the architecture of what counted as coherent thought. The Meiji period also produced a specific elaboration of the Kokutai framework that would matter enormously in the 20th century. the concept of Japan's special mission in Asia. If Japan had been created by the gods, and if the emperor was the center of a divine family, then Japan's relationship to the rest of Asia was not merely political or economic. It was an expression of cosmic order. Japan was the most highly evolved civilization in Asia. This was now dressed in social Darwinist vocabulary that the Meiji reformers absorbed from the European intellectual currents. They were also borrowing, and therefore Japan had a responsibility to the rest of Asia that went beyond ordinary national interest. This responsibility would be described in different moments and by different actors as guidance, protection, liberation from Western colonialism, and the establishment of the divine order in Asia. The vocabulary shifted with the political moment. The underlying claim remained consistent. Japan's expansion in Asia was not imperialism in the European sense. It was the fulfillment of a mission assigned at the creation of the world. This claim was available to the Meiji government because the construction of Kokutai had made it coherent. Once you had established that Japan was a divine nation with a sacred emperor descended from the sun goddess, the claim that Japan's expansion expressed cosmic order was not a large logical step. It was the natural next sentence. The test of the Kokutai framework came first in 1905, when Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. The war was significant for reasons that extend far beyond Japan. It was the first time in the modern period that an Asian power had defeated a European great power in a major conflict, and it reverberated across the colonized world in ways that the Japanese government both appreciated and tried to manage. Inside Japan, the war's outcome confirmed the framework. In the most powerful way a framework can be confirmed, it worked. Japan had been told it was a divine nation with a sacred mission. Japan had fought the largest empire in the world and won. The framework had predicted, in its general contours, that Japan's unique national character and the spirit of the imperial family animating its military would prevail against a numerically superior opponent. The framework appeared to have been right. The mechanisms of confirmation bias that this season has traced in every episode were present here in full force. The Japanese victory was absorbed as evidence of the framework's truth. The losses, the massive human cost of Port Arthur and Tsushima were absorbed as the price of the mission. The outcome was experienced as cosmic validation, and the framework, as always in these cases, was not simply benefiting from the confirmation. It was being amplified by it. A framework that predicts victory and then witnesses victory is a framework that becomes, in the next cycle, more confident, more demanding, more certain that the sacrifices it requires are justified by the cosmic stakes it has identified. The Russo-Japanese War taught the Japanese military leadership, the government, and a significant part of the population a lesson that was almost true. Japan could fight above its weight class through the application of will, national spirit, and tactical brilliance, and a lesson that was false but felt true, that the divine favor of the Kokutai framework was a strategic asset that could substitute or compensate for material deficiencies. 36 years later, that lesson would be applied to the United States. The decade after the First World War was, in Japan, something that has no single name in English. The Taisho period, named for the emperor, who reigned from 1912 to 1926, produced a specific political opening that historians have called Taisho democracy. The expansion of the franchise, the growth of political parties with genuine popular support, a relatively free press, an urban culture that was absorbing the cosmopolitan currents of the post-war world with real enthusiasm. Labor unions organized, socialist parties won seats in the Diet. Universal male suffrage was achieved in 1925. The Kokutai framework was still there. The emperor was still sacred. The imperial rescript on education was still being recited in schools. The state Shinto apparatus was still operating. But the political space of the 1920s was wide enough that these things coexisted uncomfortably with a public sphere that was arguing about them, about the limits of imperial authority, about the relationship between the sacred national polity and democratic governance, about whether Japan's national mission required expansion in Asia or could be pursued through the international institutions the post-war order had created. The Kokutai framework had not been abandoned. It had been, for a decade, in competition. The Depression ended the competition. Japan in 1929 was not insulated from the global economic catastrophe that began in that year. And in several respects its exposure was specific and severe. Japan's export economy, particularly its silk and textile industries, collapsed when American demand collapsed. Rural Japan, which had been living at the margins of subsistence in many regions even during the relative prosperity of the 1920s, experienced something closer to a humanitarian crisis. Rice prices fell by nearly half between 1,929 and 1,931. Farmers who had borrowed to invest in cash crops could not service their debts. In the northeast, in Tohoku, the region that was both economically marginal and disproportionately the source of army conscripts, families were selling daughters into labor and service because there was no other way to survive the winter. The young officers who commanded the men drawn from these families were watching this and drawing conclusions. Their conclusions were not subtle. The political parties had failed. The business interests that controlled the political parties had failed. The international institutions, the League of Nations, the Washington Naval Treaty System that constrained Japanese naval expansion had been built by the Western powers for the benefit of the Western powers, and were constraining Japan at the moment. Japan most needed room to maneuver. The framework had an explanation for all of this, and the explanation led directly to a course of action. Japan was a divine nation with a sacred mission. The political parties, the business interests, the liberal economists, these were the corruptions that had grown between the emperor and his people. The true Japan, the Japan of the imperial family, the Kokutai, the divine national spirit that had defeated Russia and was now being strangled by the compromises of parliamentary politics and the exploitation of zaibatsu capitalism. This Japan needed to be recovered, purified, restored to the direct relationship between the emperor and his people that the Meiji designers had promised. The young officers who held these views had a word for the project: Showa restoration, echoing the Meiji restoration, claiming to be doing again what the Meiji reformers had done, removing the intermediaries, cutting away the corruptions, returning Japan to its sacred essence. They were willing to kill for it. Some of them did. The period between 1930 and 1936 is one of the most violent in modern Japanese political history. And the violence is illuminating precisely because of who was committing it and why. The perpetrators were not criminals or revolutionaries in the conventional sense. They were officers of the Imperial Japanese Army men who had been trained in institutions saturated with the Kokutai ideology, who had internalized the framework completely, who genuinely believed that they were acting in the emperor's name when they killed the people they killed. In 1930, Prime Minister Hamaguchi Osachi was shot by a young right-wing activist at Tokyo Station, critically wounded, dying the following year. His crime, in the framework of his attackers, was signing the London Naval Treaty constraining Japan's naval expansion in deference to Western powers, which was, in the Kokutai vocabulary, a betrayal of the divine nation's mission. In 1932, in what became known as the May 15 incident, a group of young naval officers assassinated Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi. Inukai had attempted to negotiate with the military over its unauthorized operation in Manchuria, which had begun the previous year. He was in the middle of a sentence when the officers entered his house His last words, by some accounts, they were an offer to talk. The officer shot him anyway. Dialogue is useless. One of them reportedly said afterward, in 1936, the February 26 incident, the most ambitious of the radical officer plots unfolded over 4 days in snow-covered Tokyo. Approximately 400 soldiers, under young officer command, occupied key government buildings, the Prime Minister's residence, and the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police. They assassinated several senior officials, including a former Prime Minister and the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal. They left a document addressed to the Emperor explaining what they had done and why. They had acted to destroy the corrupt forces surrounding the Emperor and restore the direct relationship between the sacred sovereign and his divine people. The Emperor was furious. This point is important and tends to be underweighted in popular accounts of the period. Hirohito was not a passive figure watching these events from a distance. He was actively opposed to the February 26 rebels and called for their suppression. The coup was put down within days. The ringleaders were tried and executed, but the framework that had produced them was not tried. It was not executed. The framework was, in fact, strengthened by the events, not by the coup's success, which was a failure, but by the atmosphere it created. After February 1936, the political class had learned something, that the alternatives to military domination of policy were assassination and chaos. The parties did not disappear, but their room for maneuver had shrunk to the point where effective civilian control of the military was no longer possible. The military moved into this space. The specific way the military moved into that space is worth understanding, because it was not a coup in the formal sense. Japan did not have a Mussolini moment or a Hitler moment, a single seizure of power by a unified movement that then imposed its framework on a resistant state. What Japan had was more diffuse and in some ways more interesting, a gradual colonization of the policy process by military priorities, justified at every step by the language of the Kokutai framework, making opposition difficult, not primarily through force but through the framework's own internal logic. The mechanism worked roughly as follows. The military wanted a particular policy expansion in Manchuria, increased defense spending, war in China, removal of political figures deemed insufficiently committed to the national mission. The military framed this policy as a requirement of the Kokutai, as what the sacred national polity demanded, as what the emperor's divine mission required. Opposition to the policy was therefore not merely political disagreement. It was, in the framework's vocabulary, opposition to the emperor himself, a failure of loyalty to the sacred national community, the kind of thing that a person who truly understood Japan could not do in good conscience. Politicians who opposed military policy were not just outvoted, they were stigmatized as traitors to the Kokutai. Some of them were killed. All of them understood the costs. The press that criticized military adventures was not just argued with. It was suppressed under laws protecting the sanctity of the imperial family and the national polity laws, whose scope expanded throughout the 1930s as the Peace Preservation Law of 1925 was repeatedly amended to cover an ever wider range of thought and expression. The academics who questioned the divine origin of the emperor or proposed constitutional interpretations that limited imperial authority were not just disputed. They were fired, in some cases imprisoned. Their books banned, most famously in the Minobe incident of 1935. When Professor Minobe Tatsukichi of Tokyo Imperial University had his books banned, and was forced to resign from the House of Peers for his organ theory of the emperor, the idea that the emperor was an organ of the state, rather than the state's divine progenitor. This was not a radical theory. It was a mainstream constitutional interpretation that had been dominant for decades. Under the pressure of the Kokutai framework's expansion, it became unspeakable. The China War began in earnest in 1937. The Marco Polo Bridge incident of July 7, 1937. A localized military confrontation at a bridge outside Beijing that was used as the pretext for a full-scale invasion of China is often treated as the proximate start of the conflict. This framing is technically accurate and historically misleading, because it makes the war sound more accidental than it was. Japan had been in Manchuria since 1931, had been waging intermittent campaigns in northern China throughout the mid-1930s, and had military and political factions that had been pushing for a full-scale China campaign for years. The Kokutai framework provided the justification at every stage. Japan's expansion in China was not conquest. It was the establishment of the divine order, the East Asian co-prosperity sphere. As it would later be called, the creation of an Asia liberated from Western colonialism and organized under Japanese guidance. The Chinese resistance was, in this framework, the resistance of people who did not yet understand what was being done for them. The framework's relationship to the atrocities that accompanied the China campaign is one of the most uncomfortable dimensions of this history, and it requires being stated directly. The Nanjing massacre of December 1937, the killing of somewhere between 40,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war over 6 weeks, following the fall of the Chinese capital, was documented at the time by foreign observers, by the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal afterward, and has been debated by historians ever since in ways that the specific number tends to obscure rather than illuminate. The range of estimates reflects genuine evidentiary disputes as well as the political weight that attaches to the question in Sino-Japanese relations. What is not in serious dispute is that it happened, that it was systematic enough to be documented contemporaneously, and that the command structure that should have prevented it did not. The framework's role is not that it caused individual soldiers to commit specific acts of violence. The role is subtler and more structural, a framework that defines the enemy population as people standing in the way of a divine mission, that has spent years defining Chinese resistance to Japanese expansion as opposition to the cosmic order, that has dehumanized the enemy through the specific vocabulary of Kokutai ideology. This framework does not give soldiers permission to commit atrocities. It creates a moral environment in which the mechanisms that would otherwise constrain violence are systematically weakened. The machinery of restraint does not disappear. It corrodes. This corrosion is not unique to Japan. It appears in varying degrees wherever a framework that grants cosmic significance to the in-group is applied to the treatment of the out-group. But in the Japan of 1937 and 1938, it was operating in a specific and severe form. The war in China did not go quickly. This was not supposed to happen. The military's assessment informed, as military assessments often are, by the framework's confidence in the spirit and will of the sacred nation, was that China would be subdued within months. We will settle the China incident in 3 months. The Army's operational planners told each other, the phrase China incident never calling it a war, because calling it a war would require invoking legal frameworks. The government preferred to avoid suggests the scale of the miscalculation. 3 months became 3 years. 3 years became a permanent drain on Japanese resources, manpower, materiel, treasure, that was still grinding on when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and expanded the conflict into the Pacific. The framework's relationship to the miscalculation is the key thing to track here. A military and political leadership with a normal feedback mechanism, one that could acknowledge the gap between the 3-month prediction and the actual trajectory of the war, would have revised its planning assumptions. At some point in 1938 or 1939, the evidence was there. The China campaign was bogging down. The financial cost was straining the budget. The manpower requirements were competing with industrial production. The framework made this acknowledgement structurally difficult. To acknowledge that the China campaign had been miscalculated was to acknowledge that the divine mission was encountering unexpected resistance, which raised the uncomfortable possibility that the mission was not proceeding under divine favor. The Kokutai framework did not include a mechanism for the sacred national polity to be wrong about its own mission. What it included was a mechanism for explaining why the mission was taking longer than expected. The enemy's resistance was more stubborn than predicted, requiring greater sacrifice. The corrupt political elements were undermining the military's efforts. The Western powers were providing material support to China that would not have been forthcoming in a world properly aligned to the divine order. Every version of these explanations was, in the vocabulary the framework provided, a reason to expand rather than contract, more sacrifice, greater commitment, fewer intermediaries between the emperor and his divine mission. Forward. This is the pattern this season has now traced 6 times. The framework that cannot acknowledge failure does not stop when it encounters failure. It accelerates. There is a figure from the 1930s whose trajectory illuminates the period's specific pathology with unusual clarity. His name was Ishiwara Kanji. Ishiwara was a general staff officer who was, by all accounts, one of the most intellectually formidable officers in the Imperial Japanese Army. He was also, by all accounts, genuinely strange, a convert to the Nichiren Buddhist sect who had developed, from the sect's prophetic framework, an elaborate theory of history according to which Japan and the United States were on a collision course that would culminate in a final world war from which Japan would emerge as the center of a unified global civilization. He was one of the primary architects of the Manchurian Incident of 1931, the manufactured military provocation that gave Japan its pretext for occupying Manchuria. He planned it without authorization from Tokyo, confident that the framework his superiors inhabited would require them to support what he had done once it was done. He was right. The government accepted the Manchurian fait accompli. But Ishiwara, in a twist that reveals something essential about the period, became by the late 1930s one of the most consistent opponents of the China War. His objection was not ethical, it was strategic. The China War was a distraction from the inevitable confrontation with the United States and the Soviet Union that his prophetic framework had identified as the real contest. Wasting Japan's resources in an extended China campaign before the decisive moment was, in his analysis, a strategic error. His opposition had no effect. He was marginalized, posted to irrelevant commands, eventually forced out of active service. Here is the thing about Ishiwara that makes him more than a footnote. He was both a product of the framework and a critic of its specific application. He had helped create the strategic situation he was now arguing against. The prophetic certainty that had led him to manufacture a military incident in Manchuria was the same quality that led the military to ignore his warnings about China. And the same framework that had empowered him empowered the decisions he was arguing were wrong. And the mechanism that silenced him was not primarily force. It was the framework's own logic, turned against him. If you are arguing against Japan's expansion, you are arguing against the divine mission. If you are arguing against the divine mission, you have failed to understand what Japan is. The framework ate its own critics, including the ones who had helped build it. December 7, 1941 December 8 inches, Tokyo was, in the framework the Japanese government had built over the previous 70 years. The moment the framework had been preparing people for. Not this specific morning, not Pearl Harbor specifically, but a moment of this shape, the confrontation between Japan's sacred mission and the forces arrayed against it. The test that would require every Japanese citizen to give everything they had in service of the divine national polity. This moment had been the implicit destination of the Kokutai framework since the Meiji designers had first installed it in the school curriculum. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was not a surprise to the people who planned it, in the sense of being unexpected by themselves. It was a calculated gamble on a specific theory, that a devastating first strike against the American Pacific Fleet would so shock American public opinion that the United States would negotiate a settlement allowing Japan to consolidate its position in Asia rather than commit to the prompt, grinding, costly campaign that full war would require. The planners knew the United States had vastly more industrial capacity. They were betting that American will, the will of a democracy, a system the Kokutai framework had spent decades telling its military that was structurally inferior to Japan's sacred national spirit, would not sustain a long war. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who designed the Pearl Harbor operation and who commanded the combined fleet, was one of the few senior officers who understood how wrong this theory was. He had lived in the United States. He had seen the industrial scale. He told people who asked him that Japan could fight effectively for perhaps a year or 18 months, and that after that the outcome was not in doubt. He designed the operation anyway, because the decision had been made, and because a framework that has identified the confrontation as sacred does not stop when its best strategist says the sacred confrontation will be lost. Yamamoto's objections were heard and set aside. The framework required the attack. The attack happened. The first 6 months of the Pacific War appeared to confirm the framework with a completeness that the most optimistic Japanese planner had not predicted. The Philippines fell. Malaya fell. Singapore, the fortress the British had built at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. The supposed keystone of British power in Asia fell in February 1942, with more than 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendering to a Japanese force of roughly half that number. The Dutch East Indies fell. Burma fell. Across an enormous arc of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The European colonial powers that had defined the Asian order for a century were being driven out by Japan in months. Inside Japan, the victories were processed through the Kokutai framework in ways that the framework made inevitable. As confirmation, the divine nation was prevailing. The mission assigned at the creation of the world was being accomplished. The spirit of the sacred polity, expressed through the willingness of Japanese soldiers to fight with a ferocity that the framework had cultivated for generations, was overcoming the material advantages of opponents who were strong in bodies and weak in soul. This reading was wrong, and the military leadership had enough information to know it was wrong. But the framework made the correct reading difficult to articulate and politically dangerous to circulate. The victories were real, but they were achieved against an opponent who had not yet fully mobilized. The United States in early 1942 was still converting its industrial economy to war production. The British Empire in Asia was, as the fall of Singapore made viscerally clear, operating with assumptions of invulnerability that had not been updated for decades. The victories were the victories of the first engagement, against opponents who had not yet brought their full capacity to bear. The moment American industrial production reached full mobilization, the moment American shipyards were producing aircraft carriers faster than Japanese aircraft were sinking them, the logic of the conflict would reverse. That moment was already coming in June 1942. At Midway, when Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single engagement that the Imperial Navy could not replace at anything approaching the rate the United States was building its own fleet. Midway was the turn, but the Japanese public was not told this. The loss was not reported accurately. The dead were cremated at sea so the families in Japan who received the urns would not know they were empty, a specific, operational lie, decided at the command level. That illustrates how early the gap between the framework's reality and the war's reality required active maintenance. The performance of Kokutai confidence required the concealment of Kokutai failure. From June 1942, the framework and the war were moving in opposite directions. The Kokutai framework had produced, in the decades before the war, a specific understanding of what it meant to be a Japanese soldier that is worth examining directly because it shaped not only how soldiers fought but how they died, and how they were asked to die. The Meiji period had constructed a military ethic that drew on the samurai tradition Bushido, the way of the warrior, and incorporated it into the institutional culture of the modern army and navy. Bushido, in its historical form, was a complex code with significant internal variation. Bushido, as it was transmitted in the Meiji and later military institutions, was something more specific, a systematic glorification of death in the emperor's service, a redefinition of surrender as the ultimate dishonor, and a theology of the self in which the individual soldier's life was not his own, but belonged entirely to the emperor, who was also his divine father. The 1908 Imperial Military Criminal Code made surrender in the face of the enemy a criminal offense. The 1941 Senjin-kun, the Field Service Code, stated explicitly that a soldier must never endure the disgrace of being taken prisoner alive, and that death was preferable to capture. This was not metaphor, it was operational policy, backed by the framework's theological vocabulary. A soldier who surrendered was a soldier who had chosen his own survival over his duty to the divine national polity. And such a choice was not merely a violation of military discipline but a cosmic failure, a betrayal of the sacred relationship between the emperor and his people. The consequences of this framework for how the Pacific War was fought, for how Japanese soldiers fought when the strategic situation turned against them, are one of the most extensively documented aspects of the entire conflict. At Guadalcanal in late 1942 and early 1943, Japanese forces that could not be resupplied and could not be evacuated fought to the effective destruction of the units committed to the island rather than withdraw. The starvation deaths, the men who died of malnutrition and disease because resupply was impossible and withdrawal was not permitted by the framework, outnumbered the combat deaths. At Tarawa in November 1943, American forces landing on the tiny atoll encountered a garrison of approximately 500 Japanese troops and Korean laborers. When the island fell after 76 hours of combat, approximately 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Korean laborers were taken prisoner. The rest were dead. At Saipan in July 1944, and the island's garrison, knowing that the American conquest was complete, organized a final Gyokusai charge. The word Gyokusai means shattered jewel. It is the concept of dying beautifully in the emperor's service, rather than enduring the disgrace of capture. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers charged American lines in what they knew was a suicide attack. Following the military's surrender, the civilian population of Saipan, Japanese settlers who had been told by the framework that American soldiers would torture and mutilate them, that death was preferable to the dishonor of capture by the enemy, jumped from the cliffs on the island's northern tip into the sea below. American soldiers watching from the beaches tried to wave them back. Some of them threw food toward the cliffs. The civilians jumped anyway. The framework had told them what death meant in that context, and the framework was more present to them than the American soldiers waving at them from the beach. The kamikaze program is the place where the Kokutai framework's theology of death in the emperor's service reached its most deliberate and institutionalized expression. The word kamikaze, divine wind, refers to the typhoons that, in 1274 and 1281, destroyed the Mongol fleets attempting to invade Japan. The historical kamikaze were weather events. The military program, given this name beginning in October 1944, was a policy of organized suicide pilots flying aircraft packed with explosives into American ships, giving their lives as weapons. The program was organized bureaucratically, with the thoroughness of any other military operation: recruitment criteria, training protocols, the writing of final letters, the ceremony of departure, the white scarves and the cups of sake and the cherry blossoms that the specific cultural language of the Kokutai framework had loaded with meaning. Cherry blossoms, which bloom briefly and fall, had become in this framework the emblem of the Japanese soldier's life. Beautiful, brief, given entirely to the moment of its falling. The pilots were volunteers. This is the dimension of the kamikaze program that resists easy categorization and requires careful handling. They were volunteers in the technical sense. They signed forms. They were not conscripted into the specific role. The program operated on the understanding that participation was chosen rather than compelled. But they were volunteers in the way that people are volunteers when every framework they have inhabited since childhood has told them that this is what their life is for, when the framework has defined the alternative not as survival, but as disgrace. When the peer culture of a military unit has made refusal feel not like a choice but like a failure of identity. Historian Emiko Ohnukitierne, who studied the diaries and letters of kamikaze pilots, found something more complex than simple fanaticism. Many of the pilots were university students, educated, thoughtful, and fully aware of the contradiction between their private selves and the role the framework was asking them to inhabit. Their private writings often express doubt, akhrif, the desire to live, love for specific people who would survive them, and then they flew the missions, not because the doubt had been resolved, because the framework was stronger than the doubt, because the identity the framework had given them, Japanese, sacred national subject, son of the divine emperor, was more immediate and more present than the private self that wanted to live. This is the most disturbing thing the kamikaze program has to show us. And it is the thing this season has been circling towards since the first episode. The framework does not require the elimination of doubt. It requires the framework to be more real than the doubt. And a framework installed from childhood, reinforced by education and peer culture and institutional structure and the entire vocabulary through which a person understands who they are. This framework can be more real than the private doubt of a 22-year-old who's been taught since age 6 that dying for the emperor is the highest expression of what it means to be Japanese. The doubt was real. The letters prove it. They flew anyway. The experience of the civilian population in the war's final year, 1944 to 1945, is where the framework's relationship to ordinary people becomes most visible and most harrowing. The Japanese home front had been living inside the Kokutai framework for the entire war, receiving information about the conflict's progress through a media system that was entirely controlled by the state and that had been suppressing, managing, and falsifying the news since Midway. The Japanese public did not know the scale of the losses. They knew about victories or about strategic retreats to superior positions. The vocabulary, the military information apparatus used for defeats. The framework of certain divine victory was maintained, with increasing strain. As the geography of the war moved steadily toward the Japanese home islands, by 1945, the reality could not be entirely concealed because it was arriving from the sky. American B-29 superfortresses had begun the systematic firebombing of Japanese cities in March 1945. The Tokyo raid of March 9-10. 1,945 killed between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bomb. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities were systematically destroyed over the following months. By summer 1945, Japan's major cities had been reduced, in significant portions, to ash. The government's response to this reality was to deepen the framework. The concept that emerged in 1945 was Ichioku Jokusai, the 100 million shattered jewels. The 100 million was the approximate population of the Japanese Empire, including its colonies. Jokusai, the shattered jewel concept from the Saipan garrison's final charge, applied to the entire population. Every Japanese person. In the event of an American invasion of the home islands, was expected to fight and die rather than surrender. This was not a figure of speech. It was a policy. The government was preparing the civilian population to resist an invasion with sharpened bamboo spears, with whatever implements were available. In the framework's vocabulary of beautiful and sacred death in the emperor's service, school children were training with bamboo. Women were being organized into civilian defense units. Military planners estimated that a full American invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, planned for November 1945, would produce casualties in the millions. Their estimates of Japanese military and civilian deaths ranged from several 100,000 in the most optimistic assessments to several million in the more realistic ones. American casualty estimates varied enormously depending on the assumptions used, but the orders of magnitude was similar. The framework had arrived at the point where its protection of the sacred national polity required the literal death of the sacred national polity. The 100 million shattered jewels. Every one of them a person. There were people inside the Japanese government and military who understood where this was going and were trying against the framework to stop it. The peace faction, the group around Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, Kido Koichi, Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori, and several other senior figures who had concluded by early 1945 that the war could not be won, and that the framework's logic of fighting to the last person had to be overridden, was real and active throughout. They were working toward a negotiated end to the war. They were operating inside the same framework they were trying to override, which meant they could not say what they were doing in the framework's own vocabulary. They could not say Japan should surrender. They could say Japan should clarify the Kokutai, find a path that preserved the imperial institution in some form while ending the military conflict. The language of their internal communications is a masterclass in the difficulty of working against a framework from inside it. Every sentence has to be translated. What they mean is that Japan is losing and needs to stop. What they can say is that Japan should seek to clarify and protect the national polity through diplomatic means. The military faction, the group that controlled the War Ministry and the Army General Staff, and that was willing to use the February 26th threat implicitly against any civilian official who moved too fast toward peace, was also real and active. The War Minister, Anamikura Hika, was a man who genuinely believed in the framework, who believed Japan could inflict sufficient casualties on an invading American force to force a negotiated peace, who told the Supreme War Council as late as August 1945 that the Homeland Defense could succeed. He was wrong about the strategic assessment. He was not wrong, in the framework's own terms, about what the framework required. A Japan that was a divine nation with a sacred mission did not end wars by surrender. It fought until it won or until it ceased to exist. Between these two factions, in the summer of 1945, said the Emperor, the decisions made in those final months, and the role of Hirohito in making them, remain among the most contested questions in modern Japanese historiography. What is documented is that the emperor ultimately chose to override the military's opposition to surrender, that his decision was, in the specific political circumstances of August 1945, necessary to end the war, and that the framework of imperial authority was the mechanism that made it possible for his decision to be binding. The same framework that had produced the war ended it. This is not a redemption narrative. It is a structural observation. The framework could end the war precisely because it had made the war possible. An emperor whose authority was divine could override the military's resistance in a way that no civilian politician could. The sacred authority that had made 4 million deaths possible was also, in the end, the instrument through which the dying stopped. The surrender created a problem that no one in the Kokutai framework had ever planned for, because the framework did not include planning for this outcome. The emperor was sacred. His authority was divine. The national polity was an expression of cosmic order. These claims had been built into the educational system, the legal system, the military culture, the daily rituals of public life. They had been installed in the consciousness of every Japanese citizen who had passed through the school system over the preceding 7 decades. And now the emperor had just announced on the radio that the war was over. The dissonance was structural and immediate. A god who could lose was a different kind of god than the framework had described. An emperor whose sacred mission had ended in the total destruction of the cities his divine nation had built, in the deaths of millions of the sacred family he was supposed to protect. In occupation by the foreign forces the framework had identified as spiritually inferior, this emperor could still be the emperor. Technically, procedurally, in the administrative sense of the word. But the theological claim underneath the administrative category had been damaged in ways that a framework built on cosmic certainty cannot easily absorb. The Japanese people kneeling in the August streets had just experienced the most thorough disconfirmation a prophetic framework can receive. Not a setback, not a delay, not a test requiring deeper commitment, a defeat, a surrender. The unambiguous, documented, photographed, broadcast moment at which the claim the framework had made about the direction of history turned out to be wrong. What happened to the framework after that moment is what this Hoi is about. The American occupation of Japan, from September 1945 to April 1952, was one of the most ambitious programs of political and social transformation in modern history. And it was undertaken with a specific understanding of what the occupation was trying to undo. General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded the occupation as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, had absorbed enough of the scholarly and journalistic analysis of Japanese militarism to understand that the Kokutai framework, the ideological infrastructure that had produced the war, the kamikaze, the civilian suicides on Saipan, needed to be dismantled if something different was going to be built in its place. The occupation authorities moved systematically on several fronts simultaneously. In January 1946, the emperor issued what became known as the Ningen Sengen, the Declaration of Humanity. The document announced that the emperor was not divine, that the idea of the emperor's divinity was a false conception, that the ties between the emperor and the Japanese people were not predicated on the false conception that the emperor is divine. 5 sentences, the theological foundation of the Kokutai framework, stated and then withdrawn. The declaration was drafted with significant American involvement, and the Japanese officials who worked on it understood exactly what they were doing. They were, in the specific vocabulary the framework had used for 70 years, dismantling the Kokutai, the sacred national body, in order to preserve it in a different form. The emperor would remain, the imperial institution would remain, but the divine claim that had made the emperor's authority categorical rather than constitutional would be publicly renounced. The Ningen Sengen was published in newspapers across Japan on January 1. It was read, it was discussed, and then it was absorbed, not uniformly, not without confusion, not without the specific grief of people who had organized their understanding of the world around a claim that was now being officially retracted but absorbed. The Japanese public, in the immediate aftermath of surrender, was more ready for this retraction than the framework's designers might have expected. This is important and tends to be underweighted in accounts that treat the war's popular support as evidence of the framework's total hold. The popular support had been real, but it had also, in the final years of the war, been maintained by information suppression that the defeat had now stripped away. The Japanese public learning in August and September 1945 about the actual scale of the losses, the millions of dead, the cities destroyed, the futility of the last-ditch defense preparations was a public receiving information that the framework had spent years concealing from it. The disillusionment was not simply the failure of a belief, it was also the arrival of the facts. The occupation's dismantling of the Kokutai framework proceeded through several interlocking programs, and examining them in sequence reveals the scale of what the American authorities believed they were dealing with. State Shinto was abolished in December 1945. The Shinto Directive ordered the separation of Shinto from the state, prohibited government support for Shinto institutions, and ended the system by which Shinto had functioned as the ideological infrastructure of imperial sovereignty. The grand shrines were converted from state institutions to private religious organizations. The official hierarchy that had connected local shrines to the national theological claim was dissolved. The educational system was overhauled from the curriculum down. The imperial rescript on education, the text that had been memorized by every Japanese student for 55 years, that had defined the relationship between the individual, the emperor, and the state in the Kokutai framework's vocabulary, was formally rescinded by the Japanese Diet in June 1948. New textbooks were issued. The content that had formed the framework's pedagogical foundation was removed, replaced, or contextualized. Ultranationalist organizations were dissolved. The leadership of the militarist movement that had operationalized the Kokutai framework in the 1930s and 1940s was tried at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo Trials, which ran from 1946 to 1948. 7 defendants were executed, including former Prime Minister Tojo Hideki. 25 were convicted of Class A war crimes. The 1947 Constitution, drafted with extensive American involvement, imposed on a Japanese government that had limited practical ability to refuse, and restructured the entire political order. Article 1 described the emperor as the symbol of the state and of the unity of the Japanese people, deriving his position from the will of the people with whom resides sovereign power, not sacred, not inviolable, not the divine father of the national family, a symbol, deriving authority from the people. Article 9, the peace clause, renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation and prohibited the maintenance of war potential. The framework had been designed in the Meiji period to make Japan capable of fighting. The Constitution written in its aftermath made Japan legally incapable of fighting. The architecture of the reversal was as deliberate as the architecture of the original construction. And yet, the dismantling was real. Its effects were real. The Japan that emerged from the occupation was genuinely different from the Japan that had entered the war in its institutional structure, in its legal framework, in the explicit theology of its public life. But the Kokutai framework did not disappear entirely, and the ways in which it persisted are as instructive as the ways in which it was dismantled. The emperor remained. This was, from the American occupation's perspective, a deliberate calculation. MacArthur and the State Department had concluded that using the emperor's authority to facilitate the surrender and the occupation was more valuable than prosecuting him for war responsibility, and that removing the imperial institution entirely would destabilize the occupation in ways that served no one's interests. The decision was pragmatic and it was consequential. By keeping the emperor, by making him a symbol rather than a sovereign, by having him renounce divinity rather than be deposed, the occupation preserved the institutional continuity of the framework while removing its theological content. This was the minimum disruption necessary for the occupation's purposes. The minimum disruption also meant the minimum transformation. The imperial institution, now stripped of its divine claim in official discourse, retained its emotional and cultural weight in ways that official discourse could not fully control. The shrines remained as private religious institutions, now, but present in the landscape and in the practice of daily life. The vocabulary of sacrifice, the aesthetic of the cherry blossom, the cultural memory of the war dead, these did not disappear with the Shinto directive or the rescission of the imperial rescript. What disappeared was the explicit, state-enforced version of the framework. What remained was the cultural sediment that the framework had deposited over 70 years of systematic installation, and cultural sediment is not cleared by legislative action, however thorough. Hirohito died in 1979. After 63 years as emperor. His death produced a formal period of national mourning and a public debate about his wartime responsibility that had been, for most of his post-war reign, effectively suppressed, not by legal prohibition, which would have violated the occupation's constitutional framework, but by the social pressure of a society that had not fully reckoned with what the framework had required and what it had done. The historian Herbert Bix, whose 2000 biography of Hirohito drew on the detailed records of the emperor's wartime conferences and communications that had become available in the preceding decade, argued that Hirohito was more actively involved in the decisions that led to and sustained the war than the post-war narrative, which had cast him as a largely passive figure manipulated by military extremists, acknowledged. The evidence Bix marshaled was substantial. The debate it generated was real and is not fully resolved. What the debate revealed was something specific about the persistence of the Kokutai framework's afterlife. The emperor's wartime role could not be fully examined in his lifetime without destabilizing the institution that the occupation had preserved as the anchor of post-war Japanese identity. The examination was deferred. The deferral was a form of the framework's continuing operation, not its theology, which had been officially renounced, but its structural consequence, which was the preservation of the imperial institution from accountability in ways that other institutions were not protected. The framework was gone. Its consequences were still managing the terms of the discussion. The Yasukuni Shrine sits in central Tokyo, a few hundred meters from the imperial palace. It was established in 1869, at the beginning of the Meiji period, to enshrine the spirits of those who died in service of the emperor. Over the course of its history, it has enshrined approximately 5 million war-dead soldiers who died in the conflicts from the Meiji Restoration through the Second World War. In 1978, without public announcement, the spirits of 14 Class A war criminals, including Tojo Hideki, executed after the Tokyo trials, were enshrined at Yasukuni. The enshrinement was not a government decision. The shrine, as a private religious institution since the Shinto directive, made its own decisions about who to enshrine. But the consequences of the enshrinement were political in ways that the official separation of Shinto from the state did not resolve. When Japanese prime ministers visit Yasukuni, and several of Kurum, at intervals, and with varying degrees of political intent, the visits produced diplomatic crises with China and South Korea, countries whose citizens were on the receiving end of the framework that Yasukuni commemorates. The framework's victims and the framework's practitioners have not arrived at the same understanding of what the shrine represents. The shrine represents, to its supporters, the honored dead men who gave their lives for their country, whatever the country's government asked them to do. The framework that sent them to die, in this reading, is separate from their sacrifice, which deserves to be honored on its own terms. The shrine represents, to its critics in Japan and abroad, the ongoing refusal to fully reckon with the framework's ideology and its consequences, the continuation, in religious and aesthetic form, of the glorification of a war that killed millions in the name of a divine mission that the emperor himself renounced in 1946. Both readings are coherent. The inability to reconcile them is the Kokutai framework's persistent contribution to contemporary Japanese public life, not as ideology, not as state theology, but as unresolved historical memory that the framework's partial dismantling left intact. There is a final dimension of the Kokutai framework's persistence that is specific to the post-war period, and that this season's analytical frame helps illuminate. The framework, as constructed by the Meiji designers and operationalized by the wartime government, had 3 interlocking elements: the divine emperor, the sacred national community, In the cosmic mission, the occupation removed the first officially. Procedurally, with the Emperor's own cooperation, it substantially weakened the third. The idea of Japan's divine mission in Asia is not available as a legitimate political claim in post-war Japanese public discourse in the way it was before 1945. But the second element, the sense of Japan as a uniquely cohesive national community with a special character, was not dismantled. It was not the target of the occupation's transformation program, and arguably could not have been without a more thoroughgoing social revolution than the occupation was prepared to attempt. The post-war Japanese economic miracle, the rapid industrialization and growth that transformed Japan from a devastated wartime economy to the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s, was achieved in part through forms of social cohesion, corporate culture, and collective sacrifice that drew on the same cultural reservoir that the Kokutai framework had filled. The vocabulary was different. The theology was gone. But the underlying pattern, the subordination of individual interest to collective purpose, the specific intensity of group identity, the cultural pressure toward conformity and away from dissent, these patterns were continuous with what the framework had cultivated, even as the framework's explicit content had been removed. This is not an argument that post-war Japan was secretly fascist, or that the economic miracle was a continuation of militarism by other means. It is an observation that cultural frameworks leave deposits that outlast the frameworks themselves, that the patterns of thought and behavior and social organization that a framework installs over generations are not cleared by the dissolution of the framework's institutional structure. The deposits are real. They are still there. And reading them requires understanding what deposited them, which is what this episode has been doing. This season has now examined 6 prophetic frameworks. Manifest Destiny was the ideology of continental expansion dressed as divine appointment, constructed by a dominant power to make conquest feel like fulfillment. The 1,000-Year Reich was the most industrially amplified prophetic claim in the modern period, a mass movement built with searchlights and cameras and the compulsory organization of an entire society around a myth of national kaimas, destiny. The Mahdi of Sudan demonstrated the minimum conditions, a genuine gap, an existing framework of expectation. One person willing to make the claim with sufficient conviction. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom showed the framework eating itself from inside the same logic that made the movement powerful, making it incapable of surviving its own internal contradictions. The Soviet case introduced the most sophisticated and most dangerous variant, the prophetic claim that does not know it is a prophecy, dressed in the vocabulary of science. The Japanese Kokutai case adds something each of the others only partially showed. It is the case of a framework that was built by people who knew they were building it. This requires holding carefully, because it is easy to misread. The Meiji reformers who constructed the Kokutai framework were not cynics fabricating a religion they did not believe in for a population they held in contempt. The evidence does not support that reading. Many of them believed, in some genuine sense, in the framework they were constructing, or at least in the necessity of constructing it, in the political reality that required Japan to have a unifying ideology capable of sustaining the national mobilization that modernization demanded. But they were also, demonstrably, constructing it. The record is clear. The deliberate reorganization of Shinto into a state apparatus, the standardization of ritual practice, the installation of the framework through the educational system, the specific legal choices of the Meiji Constitution. These were decisions made by identifiable people, documented in the historical record, with the explicit purpose of producing a specific kind of national subject. The construction was not concealed. It was, in a specific sense, in the point. This is what makes the Kokutai case distinct from the other cases this season has examined. The Mahdi did not say, "I am going to construct a prophetic claim that will organize the grievances of the Sudanese population into a military movement." He said, "I am the expected Mahdi." He believed it. Hong Xiuquan did not sit down with a political plan and design a theology that would mobilize the Hakka communities of Guangdong. He picked up a pamphlet, read it in the aftermath of his fourth examination failure, and understood his own vision from 6 years earlier. Marx did not say, "I am going to construct a scientific-sounding framework that will function as prophecy while claiming to be law." He genuinely believed he had discovered the laws of history. The Meiji reformers sat in their offices and designed a framework. They chose which elements of Shinto tradition to amplify and which to suppress. They decided that the emperor would be sacred and inviolable in the constitution. They wrote the imperial rescript on education knowing exactly what it was intended to produce. And then they produced it. This is not a moral distinction between the cynical Meiji reformers and the sincere prophets of the other cases. The question of moral weight is more complicated than that. And the outcomes suggest that sincerity is not a reliable guide to the damage a framework can do. It is an analytical distinction. The Kokutai case is the case where the gap between the framework's claim to eternal truth and the framework's historical construction is most clearly visible because the construction was documented, intentional, and recent enough that the people who lived inside the framework were, in many cases, only 2 or 3 generations removed from the people who built it. The Kokutai case also introduces something the season has been approaching from different angles in every episode. The question of what happens after every framework this season has examined has ended, or been transformed, or persisted in forms that its founders would not recognize. The Mahdist state was militarily destroyed, but the prophetic tradition survived and entered mainstream Sudanese politics. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was annihilated and left a generation of revolutionaries who drew lessons from its failure. The Soviet Union collapsed and left behind in Russia, in the former Soviet republics, in the global left, a complicated inheritance of ideas, institutions, and habits of thought that are still being sorted through. The Kokutai framework was, of the cases this season has examined, the most thoroughly dismantled by external intervention. The occupation authorities had both the intention and the leverage to restructure the institutional architecture of the framework, the state Shinto system, the educational content, the constitutional basis of imperial authority in ways that no previous case had involved. And yet, the framework left deposits that the dismantling did not clear. The shrine visits that produced diplomatic crises. The textbook controversies that recur in every decade about how to describe the 1930s and 1940s. The comfort women disputes and the Nanjing death toll debates that are not merely historical arguments but arguments about what the framework's victims are owed by the framework's beneficiaries. The unresolved question of Hirohito's war responsibility that his long post-war reign effectively deferred, and his death did not resolve. These are not residues of the framework's explicit theology. Almost no one in contemporary Japan publicly argues that the emperor is divine, or that Japan has a cosmic mission in Asia. They are residues of the framework's unfinished reckoning, the historical accounting that the occupation's pragmatic preservation of the imperial institution made politically difficult, that the economic miracles narrative of forward-looking success made psychologically easy to defer, that the specific character of Japanese public discourse about national identity has continued to manage rather than complete. The framework is gone. Its consequences are still being negotiated. Before the final observation, and the same thing that has been said in every episode applies here, and with the particular emphasis that this case's scale requires, the Japanese people in the years this episode has examined were not a monolith of Kokutai believers. Socialists were imprisoned for opposing the framework. The records of the peace preservation law prosecutions document thousands of people who refused the framework at personal cost. Women who found the framework's definition of their role as mothers of the nation inadequate to their actual lives lived alongside and in tension with that definition. Soldiers who fought did not all fight for the reasons the framework prescribed. The letters and diaries that survived speak of homesickness, of love for specific people, of fear, of the ordinary human texture, that the framework's vocabulary of sacrifice tried to replace with something cleaner and more legible. The civilians who died in the firebombing in Hiroshima, in Nagasaki, were not the framework. They were people who had been formed by the framework, who had lived inside it, who had in many cases believed in it, and who died in it, but who were not reducible to it. They had lives that the framework does not fully describe, and that any account of the Kokutai period is obligated to remember alongside the analysis of the framework itself. The framework organized their deaths. It did not own their lives. The final observation this case contributes to the season's argument is this: every prophetic framework this season, as examined, has been, in some sense, a response to a gap between what a group of people were experiencing and what they believed they deserved, between the world as it was and the world as it should be. The Mahdi's followers were living under colonial extraction. The Taiping's followers were living under a dynasty they had not chosen, struggling with poverty and displacement. The Soviet framework addressed the genuine exploitation that Marx had analyzed with real acuity. Manifest Destiny addressed the anxiety of a new nation that needed to explain its own violence to itself. The Kokutai framework addressed a real gap too. Japan, in 1853, was facing a world that had developed new categories of power without Japan's input. That was organizing the globe into empires and colonies in ways that treated Japan's independence as contingent rather than guaranteed. The anxiety the black ships produced was legitimate. The need for a mobilizing national identity was real. The question of what Japan was and what it owed its citizens and what its citizens owed it, these were real questions demanding real answers. The Kokutai framework was an answer. It was a constructed answer, built by identifiable people, drawing on genuine materials but shaping them deliberately. It worked in the sense that it produced the national cohesion, the military effectiveness, the industrial mobilization that the Meiji designers had targeted. Japan was not colonized. Japan modernized. Japan defeated Russia. The framework worked until it didn't. And what didn't work looked like was 4 million Japanese dead. Most of Japan's major cities in ash, with atomic bombs on 2 cities, and a surrender broadcast, in which the god who had been invoked to justify all of it said the word endure because the framework that had been built for him did not include the word surrender. The gap the framework was designed to fill was real. The framework's answer to the gap was catastrophic. This is the season's central argument, stated one final time in the case where it is perhaps most visible. The gap is real. The need for an answer is real. And none of that makes the framework right or its consequences acceptable. A framework can be a genuine response to a genuine need and still be wrong about the world, still be incapable of revising itself when the evidence says it should, it still be more committed to its own continuation than to the welfare of the people living inside it. The gap does not justify the framework. It explains how the framework found its audience. Understanding the difference between those two things, between what a framework explains and what it justifies, is what this season has been trying to make possible. The god spoke on August 15. He said, endure. He meant, it is over. The framework that had been built to make him sacred had no word for what he was saying. It ended, anyway. The Meiji reformers built a god. They knew they were building one. They built it because the world required Japan to have something that could hold it together fast enough to survive what was coming. The god held Japan together. The god also took Japan to war with the United States, asked its citizens to die by the millions, and ended with the most complete military defeat in the modern period. The builders had understood the need. They had not understood the ceiling. There is no ceiling. In a framework, organized around divine certainty, there is only the next sacrifice the certainty requires, and the one after that, until there is nothing left to sacrifice. or until the god speaks and says, enough.